This is the greatest financial experiment in human history, and most people don't even realize they're living inside of it. Global debt, public, private, household, corporate, has exploded to levels no civilization has ever carried before. Today, governments borrow trillions as if it were nothing. Central banks print money with keystrokes. Families take out 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. And yet, we still talk as if debt were something normal, harmless, and permanent. The truth is more unsettling. Debt has always been a tool of power, a weapon of control, and a ticking time bomb waiting for the right spark. The real question is not if the current mountain of global debt will cause a crisis, but when and who will pay the price when the system resets. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the roots of debt itself. Debt is as old as civilization. The first clay tablets in Mesopotamia, thousands of years before Christ, were not poetry or philosophy, but ledgers, records of who, whom, how much grain, how many cattle. In early societies, debt was not just an economic tool. It was sacred. Priests and kings oversaw debts, enforced them, and sometimes forgave them in sweeping jubilee. When obligations were erased to keep the social order from collapsing. Imagine that for a moment. The very idea that the survival of society required hitting a reset button on the financial system. Debt was power, but too much debt was a danger. Ancient rulers understood what modern leaders pretend to forget, that you could not enslave an entire population with obligations forever. At some point, the system cracks. Fast forward to the Renaissance and the rise of banking families like the Medicean Florence. Debt had evolved from grain and cattle to gold and credit. Kings and popes borrowed enormous sums to wage wars, build cathedrals, and fund empires. But debt always carried risk. Spain, flushed with silver from the New World, declared bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century because the crown borrowed beyond its means. That is the first lesson. Even empires stuffed with gold can drown in debt when ambition outpaces reality. Debt was no longer just personal. It was geopolitical. It fueled wars, toppled dynasties, and redrew maps. The modern debt explosion, however, began in the 20th century. After the First World War, nations carried debts so enormous that repayment seemed impossible. Germany was saddled with reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. Obligations so crushing that economists at the time warned they would destabilize the country. They were right. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s, when Germans carried wheelbarrows of paper, marks to buy bread, was a direct consequence of debt obligations that could not be met in real terms. That disaster left scars deep enough to shape the politics that led to the Second World War. Debt was not just an accounting problem. It was the fuel of chaos. Then came 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. This was the moment the financial system of the modern world was engineered. The United States, holding dose 3 of the world's gold at the end of the war, set the rules. The dollar became the anchor, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies pegged themselves to the dollar. The idea was stability. The reality was dependence. Every nation's debt, every government bond, every economic calculation now rested on the promise that the United States would maintain discipline. For a while, it worked, but the temptation to borrow, to spend beyond one's means, never goes away. By the 1960s, with the cost of the Vietnam War and domestic programs piling up, the United States printed more dollars than it had gold. Foreign governments noticed. They started demanding gold in exchange for paper. In 1971, Richard Nixon slammed the door, ending the dollar's link to gold. Debt was now untethered. Governments could borrow and print at will, limited only by trust. That moment in 1971 was the quiet revolution. It transformed debt from something finite into something infinite. With gold gone, central banks discovered they could manipulate interest rates to control the economy. When growth slowed, lower rates encouraged borrowing. And when crisis hit, more debt was created to patch the hole. Each rescue required more leverage than the last. The 1980s saw massive expansions of public debt under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, justified as necessary for defense or economic reform. Developing countries borrowed heavily from Western banks, triggering the Latin American debt crisis when they could not repay. The pattern was set: use debt to chase prosperity, then drown when the tide recedes. The 2008 financial crisis was not, as many believe, simply about housing. It was about debt layered upon debt, a pyramid of leverage so vast that when a single corner crumbled, the whole structure shook. Mortgages were packaged into securities, sold to investors, insured with derivatives, and amplified by leverage ratios of 30 to 1. The collapse destroyed banks, wiped out pensions, and forced governments to intervene with trillions in bailouts. Here was the bitter irony. Those who borrowed recklessly were rescued, while ordinary citizens were left with unemployment, foreclosures, and austerity. Debt was revealed not as a neutral instrument, but as a system rigged to protect the powerful. Since then, the numbers have gone from alarming to surreal. Global debt has tripled in the last 2 decades, reaching more than $300 trillion by 2023. To put that into perspective, that is nearly 4 times the size of the global economy. Governments, corporations, households, all have piled on. Some nations like Japan now carry public debt levels over 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions every year with barely a debate. Emerging economies borrow in foreign currencies, exposing themselves to sudden collapse when interest rates rise. The whole system has become a giant balancing act where stability depends on the illusion that debt can expand forever without consequence. But debt always has consequences. It distorts behavior. It creates bubbles. It shifts wealth. And most importantly, it enslaves future generations. Every dollar borrowed today is a claim on tomorrow's work. And when the numbers grow too large, the repayment becomes impossible. That is why history is filled with defaults, restructurings, inflations, and crises. Debt always ends one of 3 ways. You pay it back, honestly. You inflate it away, or you default. No empire, no system has ever escaped that truth. The present-day consequences are everywhere, but most people don't see them because debt has become invisible. Think about it. When your government runs a deficit, it doesn't knock on your door and ask for cash. It issues bonds, sells them to banks or to foreign investors, and quietly builds a tab in your name. When you swipe a credit card, you're not paying, you're borrowing. When corporations announce record profits, often those profits are juiced by borrowed money used to buy back stock. The system thrives on leverage, but leverage works like gravity. It feels weightless on the way up and crushing on the way down. The entire financial system today is floating on promises. Promises that may not be kept. Take the United States, the anchor of the global system.